In the years ahead, the United States may not rush into conflict. It may drift toward it, quietly, deliberately, and with full confidence that it is doing the right thing. Not because of a single decision, not because of a single leader, but because of a way of thinking that slowly took shape, one policy at a time. Some analysts call it aggressive realism. Others see it as strategic nationalism. But many now refer to it as the Donroe Doctrine. A doctrine that was never announced, yet everyone noticed. There is no official document called the Donroe Doctrine. No signed declaration, no formal strategy paper. Yet diplomats noticed it. Allies felt it. Rivals reacted to it. The term emerged among analysts trying to describe a pattern, not a policy. A pattern where the United States defined threats earlier, applied pressure sooner, and showed far less patience with rivals and partners alike. This was not the Monroe Doctrine reborn. That doctrine kept Europe out of the Americas. This was something broader and far more confrontational in tone. Why this way of thinking returned at the worst possible time? Timing matters in global politics. The Donroe worldview did not emerge in a stable world. It surfaced during a moment of deep transition. China was no longer rising, it had arrived. Russia was no longer integrating, it was resisting. And America was no longer uncontested. Many Americans felt the ground shifting beneath them. Factories gone. Supply chains exposed. Strategic dominance questioned. Donald Trump's rhetoric gave voice to this anxiety. But analysts argue the deeper shift was strategic, not emotional. The belief was simple. If the US keeps managing decline, decline becomes permanent. 4 assumptions that quietly changed US strategy. Rather than a single doctrine, experts point to 4 assumptions that began shaping decisions. The moment America stopped waiting. For decades, US strategy relied on deterrence and delay. Pressure was something used cautiously. Under this new thinking, pressure came first. Tariffs before trade disputes escalated. Sanctions before negotiations collapsed. Military signaling before crises fully formed. Supporters argued this prevented weakness. Critics warned it reduced room for error. When trade stopped being about trade. Economic policy was no longer just about growth. It became about control. Semiconductors, energy routes, rare earth minerals. In this worldview, dependence was danger. Interdependence, once seen as stabilizing, began to look like exposure. What America started asking instead of promising. Alliances also changed tone. Instead of reassurance, there were demands. Instead of guarantees, expectations. Allies were asked to spend more, align more closely, act faster. Some saw this as overdue realism. Others saw it as erosion of trust. Either way, the dynamic shifted. Why uncertainty became a weapon. Perhaps the most controversial shift was unpredictability. Red lines were blurred. Responses became harder to anticipate. Signals were deliberately ambiguous. This uncertainty could deter rivals, but it could also invite miscalculation. History shows that ambiguity cuts both ways. Where pressure begins to overlap. No single rivalry defines global risk. China in the Pacific, Russia in Eastern Europe, Iran in the Middle East. Each arena alone is manageable. But pressure applied everywhere at once creates overlap, and overlap increases risk. Great power conflict rarely starts with intention. It starts with compression. Why so many timelines quietly point to the same window? To be clear, no serious analyst claims war is inevitable in 2026. But many do note that by the mid-2020s, military modernization cycles align, economic decoupling accelerates, political incentives harden. It is the convergence of trends, not a date, that raises concern. The case for strength and why some still defend it. Not everyone sees danger here. Some strategists argue restraint failed, that predictability invited exploitation, that power must be demonstrated to be respected. From this perspective, the Donroe approach is not reckless, it is corrective. This debate remains unresolved, and unresolved debates in geopolitics carry consequences. Because ideas mean nothing until they meet other powers. So far, we have examined the idea, but ideas only matter when they collide with other ambitions. In Part 2, we will look at how this worldview intersects with China's long-term strategy, Russia's security calculations, Iran's regional leverage. Because what feels like strength to one nation can feel like provocation to another. And history suggests that great power collisions rarely begin with intent. They begin with confidence. Next step. Reply with one line. Continue with Part 2 in the same style. You're now working at a very high documentary standard. ये वो level है जहाँ channels वाकई explode करते हैं. Not because of a single leader, but because of a way of thinking that slowly took shape, one policy at a time. Some analysts call it aggressive realism. Others see it as strategic nationalism. But many now refer to it as the Donroe Doctrine. A doctrine that was never announced, yet everyone noticed. There is no official document called the Donroe Doctrine. No signed declaration, no formal strategy paper. Yet diplomats noticed it. Allies felt it. Rivals reacted to it. The term emerged among analysts trying to describe a pattern, not a policy. A pattern where the United States defined threats earlier, applied pressure sooner, and showed far less patience with rivals and partners alike. This was not the Monroe Doctrine reborn. That doctrine kept Europe out of the Americas. This was something broader and far more confrontational in tone. Why this way of thinking returned at the worst possible time. The moment strategy stops being theoretical. Ideas are safe when they stay on paper. They become dangerous when they encounter other strategies. The Donroe way of thinking was never meant to exist in isolation. It was designed to operate in a world of rivals. And by the mid-2020s, free rivals matter more than all others combined. China, Russia, and Iran. Each hears American pressure differently. Each responds through its own history. And each turns pressure into preparation. China never heard a warning. It heard a challenge. In Washington, pressure is often framed as prevention. In Beijing, it is interpreted as containment. This difference in perception changes everything. China's leadership does not see tariffs, technology controls, or military posturing as isolated moves. They see them as pieces of a long game aimed at limiting China's future. From Beijing's perspective, the message sounded less like "change your behavior" and more like "you will not be allowed to rise." Why Taiwan is always there, even when it isn't mentioned. Analysts often point out that any discussion of US-China tension quietly circles one place: Taiwan. Not because conflict is inevitable, but because Taiwan represents overlapping red lines. For the United States, strategic credibility, alliance reassurance, semiconductor security. For China, territorial integrity, national identity, political legitimacy. Under a pressure-first doctrine, ambiguity around Taiwan becomes riskier. Signals meant to deter can be misread as preparation. Exercises meant to reassure can look like rehearsal. This is how collision courses form, not by intention, but by interpretation. When economic pressure turns strategic. Technology restrictions are often presented as defensive, but from Beijing's viewpoint, cutting access to advanced chips and manufacturing tools looks like an attempt to freeze development. China's response has been methodical, accelerated domestic innovation, supply chain insulation, strategic patience. Pressure did not stop China's planning. It changed its timeline. Russia does not think in decades. It thinks in threats. If China sees pressure as containment, Russia sees it as encirclement. Russia's strategic memory is shaped by invasion, collapse, and vulnerability. NATO expansion is not seen as partnership, but proximity. Under the Donroe worldview, predictability gave way to uncertainty. Sanctions escalated quickly. Military signaling intensified. Diplomatic off-ramps narrowed. From Moscow's perspective, pressure felt less like deterrence and more like preparation. Why Ukraine became more than Ukraine? For Russia, Ukraine was never just a neighboring state. It was strategic depth, historical buffer, symbolic boundary. As pressure increased, Russian decision-makers faced a narrowing window. Act early or lose leverage permanently. This does not justify aggression, but it explains the logic that pressure can accelerate risk. When sanctions become structural, not tactical. Sanctions were once tools meant to change behavior. Over time, they became permanent architecture. Russia adapted by reorienting energy flows, strengthening non-Western partnerships, reducing exposure to US systems. Pressure did not collapse the system, it hardened it. This is a recurring pattern analysts warn about. Iran hears pressure as permission. Iran occupies a different position entirely. Not a great power, but a regional spoiler with asymmetric tools. When US strategy emphasizes pressure without engagement, Iran interprets it as confirmation that restraint gains nothing. This encourages proxy expansion, regional leverage, strategic patience. Iran does not seek collision, it seeks endurance. Why the Middle East never fully leaves the picture. Even as attention shifts toward Asia and Europe, the Middle East remains a pressure amplifier. Energy markets, regional alliances, proxy conflicts. Pressure applied elsewhere often echoes here. This creates a feedback loop. Pressure, reaction. Reaction, counter-pressure. Counter-pressure, escalation. No single move causes conflict, but each narrows the margin. When pressure multiplies, instead of deterring. Supporters of the Donroe approach argue pressure prevents weakness. Critics counter with a different concern. Pressure applied everywhere can deter nowhere. When multiple rivals feel constrained simultaneously, coordination becomes easier. Not formal alliances, but aligned resistance. This is how strategic competition becomes systemic. The silent variable, miscalculation. Most geopolitical disasters share one trait. No one planned the outcome. Signals were misread. Intentions were misunderstood. Red lines were assumed, not confirmed. A doctrine built on uncertainty increases leverage. It also increases the cost of error. Why none of this guarantees conflict, but none of it prevents it either. It is important to be precise. No serious analyst claims, war is inevitable, collision is guaranteed, strategy equals destiny. But many do warn that compression increases risk, ambiguity multiplies error, pressure accelerates timelines. This is not prophecy. It is probability management. The question no doctrine can fully answer. Every strategy eventually faces the same dilemma. How much pressure is enough? And how much becomes too much? The Donroe worldview offers strength, but strength without calibration carries consequences. Where this leaves the world moving forward. By the mid-2020s, the world is not on the brink, but it is closer than it was. Closer not because leaders want conflict, but because each believes pressure will prevent it. History suggests that belief is both powerful and dangerous. Perfect. The question analysts rarely ask out loud. By this point, one misunderstanding must be cleared. No serious strategist wakes up wanting war. No doctrine is written with catastrophe as its goal. So the real question is not, does the Donroe way of thinking cause conflict? The real question is, what happens when multiple powers all believe pressure is the responsible choice? Because history shows that danger often begins there. Why 2026 keeps appearing without being a prediction? It is important to be precise. 2026 is not a forecast. It is not a deadline. And it is not a prophecy. Instead, it appears repeatedly in analysis because of overlapping cycles. Not one factor, many. When military timelines begin to align. Every major power plans in phases. Weapons programs, force readiness, logistics modernization. By the mid-2020s, China completes key naval and aerospace upgrades. Russia finishes restructuring post-sanctions military capacity. The US cycles through force posture adjustments in Europe and the Pacific. None of this implies intent, but alignment increases sensitivity. When forces are ready, leaders feel pressure to use leverage before it erodes. When politics compresses decision space. Domestic politics also matter. Election cycles shorten patience. Public narratives harden positions. Reversal becomes politically costly. In such environments, flexibility looks like weakness. Delay looks like indecision. This does not cause conflict, but it reduces maneuvering room. The most plausible risk is not war. It is escalation. Analysts overwhelmingly agree on one point. The most likely danger is not immediate great power war. It is escalation through layers, a crisis that begins as a show of resolve, as an exercise, as a limited response, and then expands because no one wants to blink first. Scenario 1. The Pacific compression. In this scenario, tension does not erupt suddenly. Instead, military signaling intensifies. Exercises grow closer. Messaging becomes sharper. Each move is justified as defensive. Each response is framed as proportional. The danger lies not in aggression, but in assumption. Assumption that the other side understands the signal. History suggests that assumption is risky. Scenario 2. The European feedback loop. Here, escalation comes through reaction chains. Sanctions trigger countermeasures. Force posture changes provoke adjustments. Deterrence signaling becomes routine. Over time, temporary measures become permanent. Pressure stabilizes, but also hardens. The longer this continues, the harder reversal becomes. Scenario 3. The Middle East multiplier. The Middle East rarely creates great power conflict alone, but it multiplies risk. proxy actions, energy shocks, alliance entanglements. Pressure applied elsewhere echoes here, often in unpredictable ways. A localized incident can draw attention, assets, and credibility into play. Why these scenarios are discussed, not predicted. None of these paths are inevitable. They are contingent. They depend on choices, interpretation, timing. This is why analysts emphasize management, not inevitability. The guardrails that still exist. Despite rising pressure, safeguards remain. They matter more than doctrines. Guardrail 1. Institutional friction. Large systems move slowly, by design. Military commands, diplomatic channels, bureaucratic review. Friction delays rash decisions. It forces justification. This friction has prevented escalation many times before. Guardrail 2. Economic self-interest. Even amid decoupling, interdependence has not vanished. Markets react faster than missiles. Economic shocks hurt allies and rivals alike. This creates hesitation. Not moral hesitation, practical hesitation. Guardrail 3. Strategic memory. Leaders study history. They know that escalation often outruns control. Initial confidence rarely survives contact. Victory is never guaranteed. This memory tempers ambition, even under pressure. Where the Donroe worldview fits, and where it struggles. The Donroe way of thinking excels at assertion. It clarifies boundaries, signals resolve, forces alignment. Where it struggles is calibration. Pressure is easier to apply than to withdraw. Uncertainty deters, but also confuses. Strength creates leverage, but leverage must still be managed. Why? This is not about one leader. This is crucial. The dynamics described here do not belong to a single presidency. They reflect structural shifts, power transitions, global rebalancing. Any administration operating in this environment faces similar constraints. Personalities matter, but structure matters more. The quiet truth about great power collision. Great power collisions rarely begin with ambition. They begin with confidence. Confidence that deterrence will hold. Confidence that signals are clear. Confidence that escalation is controllable. History suggests confidence is often misplaced. What still determines the outcome? The future does not hinge on doctrines alone. It hinges on interpretation, restraint, communication, timing. Pressure can prevent conflict, but only if paired with understanding. Final reflection. The world is not standing at the edge of war, but it is standing on narrower ground than before. Doctrines shape behavior. Behavior shapes perception. And perception shapes risk. The question ahead is not whether power will be asserted. It is whether restraint will remain possible once pressure becomes the default language. History rarely records the moment collision became unavoidable. It records the moment leaders stopped believing alternatives still existed.